Your wife's in the news. In fact, in the Times, she was in the Man in the News section of the Times. I noticed they had to change it to Woman in the News. It's kind of rare that a wife in Washington gets to be in the papers herself.
The story was in reference to some of the work I'm involved in, and particularly with the American Indians. We've started a new national organization, and it's very exciting. Some new things are happening throughout the country.
Senator Harris of Oklahoma, the new Democratic chairman, and his wife, LaDonna, are generally liked in Washington. One of her attractions is the fact that she is a full-blooded Comanche Indian. When the Harrises moved into a new neighborhood, somebody asked one of their children who his father was, and the boy answered, "My father is a cowboy, and my mother is an Indian."
Maybe we were about the first Comanche white couple in Washington. And, you know, and it was exotic to have an Indian woman who was charming and smart and really activist. I mean, she wasn't any kind of potted plant or shrinking violet. She spoke out strongly for what she believed in.
I think the greatest challenge is to bring about change. I believe in an organization. I believe organizing on a community level, because group pressure is what makes people respond. That you can bring about change if you organize around issues.
There were people over the years who felt she wasn't militant because they wanted her to be more militant.
She was really famous here. She was part of the Washington power structure, really. And she and her husband, Fred, they worked as a team.
She was one of the first Indian people in modern times that got the attention of the media.
It was during the Johnson years that Fred became chairman of the Democratic National Party. There were various political events. She was very beautiful. People liked to take pictures of her. And, you know, so it was a fascinating character.
She has an incredible warmth and openness and sweetness. I hesitate to say sweetness because it doesn't sound as strong as she is, but still, it's true.
She was like in Look magazine, People magazine. She was in Time magazine, newspapers. I think it gave us hope. I think it gave us a sense that, you know, Indian people were, in fact, going to get their rightful place in society from an economic, social, cultural standpoint.
Good morning. My name is Kira Seipler, Director of Operations for the Albuquerque Film and Music Experience. Thank you for joining us this morning. On behalf of AFMX, our Board of Directors, and our entire staff, welcome to AFMX Virtual Edition 2021. Before we get started with our next event, we'd like to thank our presenting sponsors, AFME Foundation, Albuquerque Film Office and Film Liaison, Cindy McCrossan, Albuquerque the Magazine, Bernalillo County Commissioner Stephen Michael Quezada, Presa Terrena Italia, olive oil, Comcast NBC Universal, Real Solutions, Airport Meet and Greet, Sunny 505, the Baker Law Group, University of New Mexico Film and Digital Arts, Larry Schwartz and Wells Fargo Advisors, Yamaha Entertainment Group, and Jousker Road Productions. Without our sponsorship support, we can't bring this festival to you. So thank you all. For the complete lineup and ticket sales, please visit our website at afmxnm.com. Please note there was a schedule change to our center stage conversations with legend Buffy St. Marie. It has now been rescheduled to Sunday, September 26th at 2:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. This conversation will be moderated by Neil Copperman of AMP Concerts and is definitely an event not to be missed. Please note during this center stage conversation, our audience members will be allowed to ask questions at the end of the Q&A. However, as you think of the questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box, and we will do our very best to get all of your questions answered at the end of the conversation. Please note, this center stage conversation will be recorded and will be available online through October 11th. Now, AFMX is proud to introduce this morning's center stage conversation, LaDonna Harris, Indian 101, with our moderator, Maura Dhu Studi. To remind our audience, this documentary will be having its AFMX premiere tomorrow, Saturday, September 25th at 4 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. We hope you can make time for this informative and important documentary. So at this time, I would like to introduce our moderator, Maura Dhu Studi. She has worked in the entertainment industry since her teens as a performer and in production. She has taught film, acting, and scene study classes in Santa Fe since 2010. In 2013, she received an Emmy for writing Silver Bullet Productions' award-winning documentary, Canes of Power. Maura is an associate producer and wrote narration for the Silver Bullet films, 1,000 Voices, Defending the Fire, and However Wide the Sky, Places of Power. She serves on the board of SBP, a nonprofit educational film company based in Santa Fe, and has been an instructor for their filmmaking workshops, which empower Native youth through film. She was inducted into the New Mexico Film and Television Hall of Fame in 2019. Maura was one of the founding trustees of First Americans in the Arts and serves on the board of directors for the Indigenous Language Institute. Please welcome Maura Dhu Studi.
Thank you, Kira. And it's my great pleasure to have this conversation today with three incredibly powerful Comanche women. I'd like to introduce them for you now. Kathryn Tijerina earned her BA from Harvard. She earned her Juris Doctorate from Stanford Law School and is a member of the Bar Association of Washington, D.C. A former president of the Institute of the American Indian, as former president of the Institute of American Indian Arts. And she's written for the Indian Policy Review Commission of the United States Congress and was counsel to the U.S. Senate Indian Affairs Committee of the U.S. Congress. And she drafted the first Indian Religious Freedom Act. Currently in retirement, she's a member of the board of the Santa Fe Indian Center and a national advisor for the Americans for Indian Opportunities Ambassador Program. Laura Harris is Executive Director and CEO of Americans for Indian Opportunity. Before joining AIO, she served on the original staff of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, and she's worked in the DC office of US Senator Jeff Bingaman. She founded and was the first chair of the Native American Democratic Caucus of New Mexico, and was appointed by President Clinton as senior consultant to the President's Initiative on Race. In the past, she served on the National Governing Board of the Center for Policy Alternatives, National Committee for Responsible Philanthropy, and Parents and Families and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. She also serves on the national boards of the Latin American Working Group, the Native American Hall of Fame, and the Albuquerque Biopark Community Advisory Board. And LaDonna Harris is president of Americans for Indian Opportunity. As a national leader, Harris has influenced the agendas of the civil rights, feminist, environmental, and world peace movements. She was a founding member of Common Cause, the Women's Political Caucus, and the National Urban Coalition as an ardent spokesperson against poverty and for justice. As the 1980 vice presidential nominee on the Citizens Party ticket with Barry Commoner, Harris firmly added environmental issues to that and future presidential campaigns. She was the US representative for UNESCO and to the OAS Inter-American Indigenous Institute. She's been appointed by Presidents Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Bill Clinton to several commissions. And currently, LaDonna serves on the boards of Think New Mexico, the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, and the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. Welcome, ladies. I am so honored and so excited to be sitting here talking with you this morning. And first, I'd like to ask you, so the title of the documentary that's to be screened at the festival is LaDonna Harris, Indian 101. Can you tell me what's behind the concept of that title for the documentary, and also how that reaches into your work today?
You tell. Well, she's telling me to tell.
Okay. So Laura, tell us about that as president of, as the CEO of AIO.
Well, I'll tell it as she always says. When she got to Washington and wanted to create change, she found out that decision makers at the highest level really had no understanding of Native Americans in the United States. They didn't understand that we were governments and part of the federal system of governments, and therefore were incapable of being of assistance because of they're victims of the US education system, as we all are. We're not a part of the history books. We're not taught in political science or civics. And so when Native Americans lobby for change, these decision makers don't understand even sometimes what they're asking. So she found that you had to provide Indian 101 to these decision makers. We called it that to be funny. And she would do it in informal ways and formal ways. And now we have a formal Indian 101 presentation of what some people would call a cultural competency training. But it's all fashioned after her original outline for how we should approach educating others so that we can create change.
So let's just get back to that for a minute. This is the concept of cultural competency. And so how do you think that the ignorance on the part of just the general public and even people in Washington contributes to systemic racism?
Well, it was obvious. For instance, coming to Washington, I thought, well, I'll go to these different agencies because I had been working in Oklahoma on environmental issues, Native American rights. And so I would just plug us into the national scene, but found that there were programs in that area. So I helped develop each of these area programs, and particularly departmental, going to each of the departmental and having them have an Indian desk, like Health and Human Services and so on, is that they would have someone on their staff that was informed about Indians. And then trying to educate the national legislators was another effort. So we kind of made a hit of being the Indian in Washington. So that was all right with me.
But your point is also very good, Maura, because if you don't understand Indians and their governmental relationship, you cannot understand how Indians are treated in a systemic way, in a way that undercuts their authority, and a way that undercuts or tries to undercut their self-determination.
And a very specific example we could talk about today, or all we offer today, is the Indian Child Welfare Act. My sister is actually working for the United States Senate when that was passed. It was necessary because we have a long history of Native children being removed from their families, either by boarding school, missionaries, social services. And so the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed so that tribal governments would have the jurisdiction over Native children being placed outside of their home, so that they could be placed with family, so that they could remain in the community, and that they could be surrounded by their culture. But right now, there is an organized effort to undermine the Indian Child Welfare Act. And their claim is that it's unfair because it's based on race. But that is showing their ignorance. It's not based on race. It's based on their citizenship in their tribal government. And that's just like being a citizen of a state. And so it's not a race-based program. It is based on the fact that we're political entities. And there is a very strong movement right now. So that's how systemic racism is perpetuated by this continued ignorance.
So, oh yeah, Kathryn, go ahead.
I was just going to comment that in international law, one of the definitions of genocide is taking people's children away, because if you don't have any children, you can't continue. And so that's why it's critically important to all Indian governments to make sure that their children are protected and not removed from their culture.
So what's at stake here is actually the right that the children have and the right communities have to raise their children with their cultural values and their culture, correct?
Exactly.
Yes. So let's talk a little bit about the native sovereignty and how that impacts or exists within the United States. Can we talk about that a little bit? Because I think that's a very interesting subject.
Yes, it's very unique and very precious, I should say, because it's for how many years they've tried to change that, to do away with tribes having the right to have jurisdiction over their membership of the tribe, as well as the land base that they that was a part of their original history. And so it's a very important tool, and we have to see it in that it's part of our children growing up, that they have a home base, they have an identity, they have a language base that continues to use the language in all aspects of their lives. So it's an important thing to protect and be conscious of it at all times, because we're always under attack in some way of taking all of this, the things that tribes have, away, so that the federal government could just call the shots on what was being done. So that's important for us to.
So we really are, there's a federal framework, and then tribal governments are a part of that. That's why if a tribe is wholly within one state, the state still doesn't have jurisdiction over them. They have the right to control their own territory and people. And that was a part of the original laws of the United States. It started out with the right of conquest, which is basically, we conquered you, therefore we have the authority over you. It's a kind of might makes right argument. And the Supreme Court then said, well, tribes are sovereign, domestic dependent governments, nations. And there are some tribes who have never accepted those terms. For example, the Iroquois have issued their own international passports, and that drove the State Department, the US State Department, just crazy.
The interesting thing, well, what Mom said is it's unique, and all Americans should be immensely proud of the pluralisticness of the United States government and its potential. For instance, in Afghanistan, you could look at that and not say it was a military failure or an intelligence failure. It was a cultural competency failure. If Americans in the State Department had a better understanding of the federal system and how we can retain our cultural and political autonomy under a larger umbrella, which is the concept of the Iroquois Confederacy. And there were many indigenous confederacies at the time of contact in North America. So that concept is really amazing in the world, and we could share that idea with others. And it is a solution to create pluralistic government and pluralistic societies. So all Americans should be proud of it, and all Americans should learn truly what the federal system is.
Yeah, so the Indian Self-Determination Act did not come about until when? The 60s?
1971.
71, even more recent. And I know LaDonna had a great deal to do with that coming about.
That's right.
It followed the struggle for
Yes.
Taos Blue Lake.
Absolutely.
Taos story.
Well, you probably, the Taos people were the first tribe to be able to protect their own right to exist, actually. And so that their efforts created a system and the recognition of the federal government that tribes have a right to exist in the federal government, in the United States system.
It was in the past when the federal government had illegally taken land, tribes had only been able to get money back for the land that was taken. But the Taos people for 60 years said, this is sacred to us. We don't want money for it. We want the sacred site back. And it was the very first time that tribes had ever been able to get land back from the federal government. And it became a keynote, not just for the tribes in the United States, but for Indigenous people worldwide. And Mother was incredibly instrumental in supporting and helping the Taos people in that return of land.
And so that's her involvement in that, creating a bipartisan coalition of not just members of Congress, but also churches, unions, to be in support of the return of this land to the people of Taos. And that really led the Nixon White House to work with her as she founded Americans for Indian Opportunity to help author the Self-Determination and Indian Education Act.
And that really changed things for Indian country, didn't it? Like
Yes.
a great advance for them being recognized as autonomous sovereign nations.
And it was the first tribe that attempted it, and that it worked was the beauty of it. I could weepy talking about it.
Well, I know, and I love that story about Taos Blue Lake. It's such a beautiful story. And I thank you for sharing that with us. Let's talk about the idea, especially previous to the Indian Self-Determination Act, what was going on in the United States and the push by the government to assimilate Native people, and the difference between the concepts of integrate versus assimilate.
Go ahead.
So it was actual policy of the federal government to assimilate tribes. They had a saying back then of kill the Indian and save the man, by which they meant we'll take away everything Indian about you and you'll still be here as a physical person, but you won't be Indian anymore. And that's the whole concept of assimilation, that will make you into model US citizens in our image. And tribes, of course, fought back against that because we think we have a culture and a way of being and a way of knowing that's very valuable and is still valuable today to not only this country, but to the world. And so integrating is just merging different groups together. But because we had boarding schools and relocation and a whole bunch of federal policies whose intent was assimilation, it was very damaging to tribal governments and tribal peoples. And it's something that we have we now have more of a renaissance getting away from those things. And that's why that Self-Determination Act was so important, because it reversed termination, was another Eisenhower effort, where tribes were actually lost all of their legal rights as governments. Some tribes did, and that was incredibly destructive.
I mean, one of the things I learned in working in Oklahoma of why we had such a large dropout rate from public schools. And, you know, and I know that our children were just as bright as any other child, and probably brighter in some ways, but they weren't being considered or accepted in the same way. So that was a real shock to me. But it really was a fact that you had to learn. That is, Oklahoma was the land of the Indians, you know, where everybody was pushed into Oklahoma. And but there was no legislation or nothing in Oklahoma that protected us. So that was part of what I did in the early stages, is look at that. Mostly it was because it just came slapping me in the face that why our children were all being dropouts of the school system.
There was a 72% dropout rate in Oklahoma for Native students dropping out of high school. 72% in the mid 60s. And then Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity was founded, and they did this amazing program. Seems so simple. John Trudell was one of the original staff at Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity, and he teamed up with Mom, and they created a curriculum for Native students that basically was just a mimeograph booklet of famous Indians. And they found out that these kids didn't know there were famous Indians, didn't know there were successful Indians, didn't know that Indians went to college. And so just that simple raising their confidence, their cultural identity, strengthening their cultural identity, she was able to change that statistic from 72% down to about 35% in a matter of 4 or 5 years. That's how simple it was. And when we talk about being on the bottom of every socioeconomic indicator, nearly all of them, Native Americans across the board, across the United States, it's not an accident. It is the direct result of a set of federal policies aimed at ending the Indian problem and having to end special programs for Native Americans that are our treaty rights, and ending their ownership to land is really what it was all about. So those things were devastating to our community. And like Kathryn said, we're now seeing a renaissance of that absolute opposite of indigenizing everything we do, instead of following kind of the Euro-American colonized ways of looking at problems.
And go ahead. And the other thing, I went around the state making speeches in regard to this, and also bringing books about the tribe that was in that vicinity of that school, and challenging them to have organize around. So we had Indian organizations in the public schools that they developed themselves, and they varied from being really strong to, anyway, they were organizations, and that was nice. And so we would have an annual meeting at the University of Oklahoma and have a speaker, and we had the Secretary of Health and Human Services at one time,
Robert Kennedy,
Mondale, come to speak to the Native American community. So that gave them some prestige in their particular schools.
And it's important to recognize that these things seem common sense to us now, but Mother had no role models. She had to figure out how to do this organizing, community organizing. There wasn't people who told people how to do that. She created those ideas.
Yes,
and it was based on her Comanche values.
So I would like to ask you, at the basis of OIO, which was Oklahomians for Indian Opportunity, which later became Americans for Indian Opportunity, AIO, which is still extant today and a very exciting and powerful organization. What I know that, like, for instance, in the boarding schools and what have you, there was a larger emphasis most of the time on technical education, trades education for Native people. So did OIO help to impact the change in the Indian boarding schools towards a more academic presentation and education for Native students?
Yes, and the socialization too was, I think, was most important. You almost had to do that before you could change the institution. It was to have the young people organize and have a Indian club in their school system and in their school, and so that they can talk about their tribes, their individual tribes, and then give them a sense of both ownership of an idea and also a sense of pride of who they were. And so that we had these clubs in every school in Oklahoma, and that prestige really helped everybody see themselves in a different light. And we had people graduating, and then having like people like Bobby Kennedy come and talk to them and just give them a special view of themselves that they've never had.
And one very special graduate of the OIO youth program is somebody you know very well, Maura.
Oh, yeah.
Wes Studi participated in OIO's youth program.
Yes, and he talks about that as being, a real eye opener in terms of what could be and how to, promote and sustain your cultural connections, which hadn't existed before. I know that at AIO and in OIO, you talk about, is it the 4 R's of Native values? Can you tell me what those are?
You'll have to.
Well, tell a little bit about your grandparents and how you came to articulate your values.
Well, I was raised by my grandparents. My mother had to work in Indian Health, which was about 50 miles away from home. And it was, excuse me. So I was raised by my Comanche grandparents, and we had to, I thought everybody lived like I did, because I had my grandfather, wore braids and the big hat of the period, and grandmother still wore her traditional clothes. And so I just thought everybody lived like that, and that was such a fun thing, and then to be related to everybody in the world because of it. So every Comanche is somewhat related to me. I can find a kinship. Was really reassuring to me as a person. And so, boy, I came to school, going to school in Temple, Oklahoma, and talked about
Dick and Jane.
And Dick and Jane was, the book that every child that, I don't know if it's outside of Oklahoma, but in Oklahoma, every young child had to learn Dick and Jane and the values of it.
I did too.
Yeah, you recognize the book. And so we had to talk about that. And
the American Family.
Yeah, that's right. The American Family were Dick and Jane, a dog and a cat.
Two parents.
Two parents. And there was a stereotype of what the American family looked like, which was, just probably the least number of people really looked like that. But that was the story and the image that was pounded into our youth, our Indian youth's head.
And how'd that make you feel?
And that made us feel like we didn't belong. We didn't belong in the system. It was just one of those things. And so we were outside of even the small schools in Oklahoma, that we didn't belong in them because the books like Dick and Jane kind of showed us how. And I went home, I know when I first was exposed to them, because I had this image, even as a child, what it should look like. And then when Dick and Jane came along, that was so disruptive to me that I had to go stay home for a couple of days and cry because I didn't know how to take it into my consciousness. So that was Dick and Jane. There weren't any books about Indians at all at that time, and very few up until the 60s did we get literature that was broad enough and distinct enough to really make a difference.
So those values.
So those values were Dick and Jane was, actually was eliminating. If you weren't like Dick and Jane, then you didn't have you weren't worth developing, basically.
And in the 1980s, I'll pitch in so you can get some water. In the 1980s, Americans for Indian Opportunity, spearheaded by LaDonna, worked with several tribal governments to talk about articulating your indigenous values, and then how do you imbue your governing documents and governing processes with those values? Because of course, most tribes had to adopt a foreign form of governing in order to receive federal appropriations. So we call them the Indian Reorganization Constitutions. So she started this idea of articulating your values. And if you're going to incorporate your traditional values in a contemporary way, you have to articulate those values. So she sat down and really gave a lot of thought to what were those values that her grandparents instilled in her. And she realized that every project that she worked on, she was filtering it through her values. Anybody whose English is their second language, as Comanche was her first language, they'll tell you that they have to translate it into their original language in order to really understand deep concepts. And so she realized that not only was she running it through the language, she was running it through her values. So if a project was proposed, she could kind of say, well, I don't think that's going to work because it's not in line with our values. So we, over a long period of time, she was able to kind of distill those values into what we call the 4 R's, or Hayaroquet. Hayaroquet in Comanche means number 4, but it also has a double meaning. It also means just right. 4 is an important number for Comanches. And so these 4 concepts, these 4 principles really are Hayaroquet. They're just right. And if you're following those values, then things will be good. You're making the next right step.
And I would like to say at the same time, how this happened, but we started for adults. Every tribe then started having dialogue amongst themselves, and so it just blossomed out into a whole statewide initiative, and what tribes needed and how to articulate them. Some were dominated by their Anglo neighbors, or somebody who was leasing their land, or whatever. They all had different issues that kept them from participating in their own tribal values. And so that when we started talking about it and got the University of Oklahoma to have some discussions, papers were created, that it emboldened Indian people to about governing themselves.
So the 4 R's, the 4 core values are relationships. Comanches believe that we're related to everyone, not only all human beings, but to animals and to plants and even to mountains and certain rocks. And that relationship is very important because it also defines your responsibilities. Responsibility is the second R. It tells you how you should act, what your roles and responsibilities are to each relationship. If we're related to Mother Earth, then we're environmentalists because we have to honor that relationship with the responsibility of caring for her. The other R is reciprocity, the cyclical nature of nature, of the cosmos, of human interactions and the human life cycle. All of those are reciprocal. And also, finally, redistribution. And a lot of people get nervous in the capitalist system when you say redistribution, but we're not just talking about money and land. We're talking about intellectual property. You've got certain skills, you've got certain ideas. Those are things to be shared with the community. And if we all share it, then we are all much stronger.
And it brings balance and a better, equaler distribution of power. Equaler? Is that a word? Sorry. It's early.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for articulating the 4 R's because I've been curious exactly what they were, as how you defined them, and they seem like things that actually the world needs right now.
Exactly.
Maura, we were brought up. She was brought up by her traditional grandparents. Her grandfather practiced his traditional medicine ways, and she brought those values to our family. And luckily, we had a great dad who was a good Comanche captive. That is our tradition. We take captives, and we are a matrilineal. So the male partner joins the woman's family, and he embraced those same values. And so Kathryn and I and my brother really blessed to have been brought up with those values as well and able to articulate them. And we use them in our work. AIOs, administration, as well as programming are all organized around those 4 R's. And now there's a real renaissance going on. Everybody's talking about Indigenous values, Indigenous worldview. And that's really the crux of the ambassadors program that Mom envisioned, is you can bring your Indigenous values to any part of your life. You don't have to leave them behind and adopt foreign values. You bring those values, and that we have something to contribute. Those values are important for the world. They're basically human values, and they belong to all of us. And talking about them, articulating them, and then practicing how you implement those traditional values in a contemporary context.
Right.
It doesn't come natural to us. We have to practice. We have to talk about how that process looks. What does that look like? We have to re-indigenize the way that we do things.
Sure. Let's talk about the actual film now a little bit, which I saw a while ago, and it sticks with me, LaDonna. Just I'm so grateful to learn more about your growing up and your family and all the incredible things you've done. How did the film actually come about?
I don't remember. We are very fortunate to have very smart relatives. And Juliana Branham, who's an award-winning filmmaker, produced and directed LaDonna Harris Indian 101. I would recommend her other production. She was the series producer for Native America, a 4-part series on PBS that is brilliant. and that all Americans should take a look at. But she approached us and said, "Gosh, you've got to we've got to capture her life and her work." But also what it does is really captures a part of history, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when such great change was taking place during this self-determination era. And it's not a part of our history books yet, this modern history. But this is what got us to where tribal governments are today, and how we view our cultural identity really comes from that time period, and LaDonna and the other activists, national activists who worked on issues, just kind of one at a time. And so that's what we love about the film. And it was a majority Native crew, and Julie was, funding is always an issue, but she just single-mindedly raised the money and got this done. And we're lucky that she's our relative. She's a Comanche, by the way.
Yes. And I'm so grateful that this film was made, because it does absolutely capture a part of history for Native people, but also all Americans, in what brought us to where we are now and how much further we have to go still, I think. But it's very informative. And LaDonna, you were just such a powerhouse in those days. Well, you are still a powerhouse. You're always a powerhouse. But what do you think made you, just so invested in bringing Native culture and Native people to be in the eye of government, when they've been so ignored and basically invisible, really?
I think it mostly comes from my grandparents who actually raised me. Excuse me. And my grandfather was a peyote man, and we had a little nest of peyote for his use. And then grandmother was a Christian, and grandpa would drive us to church, and we'd all be cleaned up, with good shoes, our better shoes, not go barefooted, and go to church. And so that what both of them brought to me was that you could coexist and be strengthened both sides. It gave us a different look about people talking against Indian religion, and then to see Grandpa pick us up and take us to the church. He didn't go into the church, but he sat out there till we came out, and so he did all the things that he should as a member of the family. So growing up in that environment, and Comanche being spoken at home, Papa could curse in English really well. His English wasn't that good, but his curses when he was angry. But just growing up with them and having two major different kinds of views for them was also, and they got on so well. We all got on so well living in that environment. Papa when he would take us to church, he'd sit outside the church, and then we'd go home, and he'd sit out when the sun was going down and say his prayers and sing songs. And I think that
what did he say about medicine?
What
medicine? That
don't mess with other people's medicine.
Yeah, don't mess with other people's medicine. That was one of the things I learned. And it was also watching the two of them, grandmother going down, the religious road that we think of religion, and Papa maintaining his, also gave me this feeling that it was wonderful that you could be like that. And as I got older, it was really a great thing for me to see how Grandpa took care of us, And as I said, he'd get mad at us and curse every once in a while, but it was just wonderful living with both of them and having, to take in their beliefs as, so I think it's made me a great liberal.
And then, isn't that where you got the idea that everybody has medicine? They just need the opportunity to contribute?
Yes, that it gave me to look at individuals and nurture everybody else's values, to not to be so critical and thinking I've got the best values. Is that look at other people's values, and I found I incorporated so many more tribal values within our organizational system because they seem to work for us better. So that I really am pleased that I grew up with them.
And I think it led her to have this amazing ability to look at a situation. She's a natural bridge builder between cultures, between peoples. And she could look at a situation and envision what needed to happen, who the people were who needed to work on it, and they might not be the head of an organization, they might be the secretary with a small s, or someone, just someone who could leverage something to get things done. She was just had that ability to find the people and the solutions.
We call her the connector in chief. That's what she did, connected people and also recognized their medicine. When we say medicine, we mean their personal strength, their what makes their personal power, and how to cultivate people's medicine and connect them to other people. In community organizing, you learn about a thing called power analysis. If you want to create change, you have to analyze who's in power. Well, she does that intuitively and always has, and would know who the person was that needed to be worked on and who would be the best people to go over there and work on them.
Yeah, I just want to say too, we're going to go to start answering some questions pretty soon.
Okay.
But I just wanted to say that, this really sheds some light on how LaDonna came up with the AIO's and Young Ambassadors program. Exactly. And her leadership programs, that allow people of many different cultures to use their personal medicine to become leaders for their people. And I think that's really important. Let's see what kind of questions we have here. We're going to open up the questions now.
Thank you for that compliment, sister. It really makes me feel good.
Let's see. Okay. Here's a question. Do you think there's a sequel in the works for the documentary?
Well, there's a book.
Great.
My sister has recorded just about every story we could get out of her over the last few years. So we have transcripts. Anybody out there want to come organize it for us? So when we have time, we're trying to organize her memoirs, and it really almost reads, and I think so does the film, as a guide for community activism, for movement building through an Indigenous approach.
Absolutely. I found the documentary so incredibly informative, as I said, with background on LaDonna's life and her incredible breadth of interest. She brought Native issues into other mainstream issues so that Native people would not be left out of the wider conversation, such as the war on poverty and everything, which they could, when they started that, they could very easily have just ignored Native people. but Native people were brought into and included in the war on poverty in a way. What advice do you have for storytellers to change the narrative about Native values?
Well, I don't know if I would want them to change, maybe incorporate. Well, they look at your elders and listen to them, I think, and then figure out, am I saying it right? Do I need, took me a long time to get all the right words together because I didn't have a terrific vocabulary anyway. And to say it where non-Indians could understand it without being too fragile and so that could open a door for them to come in, because that's what I always saw about my grandparents, both being, one was church going and the other was peyote practice, that if they could live together like they produce this family for me and practically every one of their children, that we could incorporate it in our in other people's lives, particularly in Oklahoma, where there are a lot of the tribal societies were still strong at that time. But over in Eastern Oklahoma, the Bureau of Indian Affairs controlled them. And we broke that tie too. So that
and now most of them are the largest employers in the state of Oklahoma and doing quite well. I think Maura, through the ambassadors program, she's been able to encourage now about 350 leaders who are all working in some way towards building capacity in our community, but really invested in changing that narrative. And from Bird Running Water at Sundance Films, he's changed forever the way Hollywood looks at Native films. And because he's been training filmmakers who are now sharing the narrative. Lee Francis has the only Indigenous comic book store in the country, Red
Right.
Planet. That is giving us futurisms, Indigenous futurism. So we were taught we were the vanishing race and that we were going to disappear. And that's what Native children grow up with, that their culture has no value and is going to disappear. And so creating a new narrative and futures is really important. We have Tracy Goodluck in the White House, incorporating Indigenous values in what decision makers in the White House are doing. So her breadth has been very wide in changing that narrative by working with emerging Indigenous leaders and encouraging and reinforcing their cultural identity and how important that cultural identity is to them being successful human beings. But also then we can share those values with more people on a global scale. And we think that they offer a different worldview from kind of the Western Euro-American way of doing things.
Well, yeah, there's a couple of questions here too that I want to address that we, about Native filmmaking, since we're talking about a film, a documentary here. And I've got two questions here, which I'm going to kind of combine so that, because you give such comprehensive answers. But how do you feel about non-Native screenwriters telling stories that use Indigenous wisdom as a main feature of their storytelling? And then again, rephrase how we can help non-Native filmmakers change the narrative. And I'm going to ask you too, should we even? Because we're really moving into an area where we're seeing more Native filmmakers coming to tell their own story, which is, I think, what's been lacking for a long time.
Yeah, well, non-Natives don't need to tell a story anymore because we have Native filmmakers and writers and authors and professors and doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs now, and we tell our own story. And I think Hollywood's getting hip to that fact.
Finally.
And because we have so many talented people who are now being recognized for their talent, like Sterling Harjo and Reservation Dogs. We don't need others to tell our story anymore.
But I would also say that it's important for non-Indian filmmakers to remember that everyone's indigenous from someplace. So it's important for them to think about their own cultures and their own histories and talk about those ways of knowing. Because I think there's a lot of value in going way back and understanding. Our dad is mostly Scottish, and I never understood why Comanches and Scottish made such a good marriage. But then one time I ran into a Scottish theologian who wrote a book on that subject, and it turns out there's some real resonance between the old traditional religions of Scotland. So those are the kinds of things that we don't ever hear from modern filmmakers. And so I think it would be valuable for them to explore those ways of knowing as well.
And it's really exciting right now because the narrative is shifting amongst archaeologists and anthropologists because we have more people of color going into those fields. So they're changing the narrative. And we're looking more and more at ancient peoples. And we're giving ancient peoples a lot more credit for their levels of sophistication. So it's the more Native Americans are reflected in every areas of society, from government to entertainment to history and archaeology, the more that narrative changes to be more of the reality.
Right. There's another question which sort of touches on that in, what was happening before, which is what is his impact of historical and contemporary misrepresentation and misappropriation of Native culture?
Well, you could tell.
Tell me which story.
Mom served in 1969. I think the report came out in 1971 on a joint commission on the mental health of children. And she had some colleagues who were people of color. The majority of the commission were Anglo, and the minority members of the commission got together and they created a minority report that the main commission refused to incorporate in the official report. But they, in 1969, determined that white racism was a #1 mental health problem for all children in the United States. So when one of the forms of the culture of oppression is that the oppressed people begin to believe the representation that is created and shared by the oppressor. So that means that, the larger society of the United States had an image of what Native Americans were. And unfortunately, because we are victims of the US education system, we often begin to take on those stereotypical things ourselves. And that is very detrimental to children. Children who witness it and children who experience it, it has a detrimental effect. And that's why representation doesn't just matter, representation is required. When we see a show like Molly from Denali, and I get to watch that with my granddaughter who is Alaska Native, to watch Molly from Denali on PBS. I want to cry every time because even though she's a little blonde-headed Inupiaq, she can see that her culture is valued by the larger society and reflected in forms of education and entertainment. And when we're not there, like we found in Oklahoma, when you're not reflected in the education system and in the media, you think less of yourself, and you certainly have a hard time being successful in this Western society.
And so it's not just we're telling our own story, but if you as a non-Indian are telling a different story, be sure and check in with Indian people about how they relate to that story. For example, Juliana is working with Ken Burns now on a Buffalo series. Well, you can't really tell a Buffalo series unless you talk about the Comanches as well. So, I mean, those are the kinds of examples that, make sure there's a reflection, a representation, and that Indians tell that part of it, even if the main story is got a different direction.
Yeah, it's important to incorporate the worldview of the people involved. And I think that's a big red flag for non-native filmmakers, to make sure that they incorporate and accurately relay the worldview of the people they're talking about.
I like the use of red flag.
One example,
that red flag.
A book that we do not recommend, written by a non-native person, a non-Comanche, about Comanches, the Empire of the
Sun, no,
of the Moon, or whatever it's called.
It's Killers of the Flower.
The author admits that he never talked to a Native American, and yet he wrote a book that's supposed to be about Comanches, and it's so inaccurate. And it made the bestsellers list, and it just hurts our feelings.
Pulitzer Prize. I think the people on the Pulitzer Prize committee ought to be
horsewhipped.
So that's the book Empire of the Sun? Is that the one?
Yeah, Empire of the Rising Sun, or it's got Quanah Parker on the front of it.
It's the one about Quanah Parker.
He exploited Quanah Parker's story and image, and he never talked to a single Comanche.
That's outrageous.
And the book that we would recommend is The Comanche Empire, which talks about, he just recently wrote one about the Sioux Nation, where he talks about us in modern geopolitical terms of what was taking place, not these little primitive, unorganized brown people running up and down the plains, but really talked about how we built empire. And, some native cultures don't build empire. Comanches, we were kind of into it for a while.
Yeah, you were. So this is a question from LaDonna. You are a pioneer and a hero to women, and how do you think that? How does that relate? Do you think that you were respected in the same way, or paid attention to in the same way that someone like Russell Means was? Interesting question.
Well, that's an interesting comparison. Of course, Russell was, we talked to each other and exchanged ideas too, but I was involved in several women's organizations. And they, that was a hard road to go. Just the lack of not being exposed to any of this wonderful history, that they just knew this narrow concept, and then they were working for the rights of women, but not necessarily all women. And so doing that was an interesting exercise for me to try to.
What was that experience when you were with Gloria Steinem and others?
Betty Friedan.
Organizing the Women's Political Caucus, wasn't there a kind of meeting of a come to understanding conversation about the women of color?
Yes, that Gloria Steinem and who was the other?
Bella
Abzug. All of the women that know of that period were getting together, and Shirley Chisholm, and others of that time. And help me with the question about how they viewed women of color. And so, I took it on as my responsibility to bring in all women, and
connector in chief.
Yeah, Do you remember some of the stories that were?
Well, the African American women, just realized that when and I think the suffragettes also had this issue, that you can't just be for the rights of white heterosexual women, you have to include everybody. And so a lot of the Anglo women at that time were worried that if you included people of color and lesbians, that would give the wrong appearance of the women's movement. And so the women of color got together and said, well, you can't be for women if you're not for all women. And you were asked to choose, weren't you?
Yes, between the two organizations.
Physically divided into different rooms.
Oh, wow.
And so they asked, well, which one do you belong to? So I went with the African American group because, they were tribes. There were much more things that were more like Indian tribes than the larger group, because they were just thinking of themselves, or that in the narrow sense of women.
But they changed, they quickly changed. And of course, they were smart enough to recognize,
Yes.
And with LaDonna's assistance, we're able to be a lot more inclusive.
Well, I would think too that there was a little bit of a struggle in that time, and in all organizations actually, for women being equal to men in terms of being, powerful. But it's interesting that too, as a Native woman, you bring to that the powerful history of matrilineal power in most tribes, where women had a lot more power than women in the United States did later.
That's right.
And although, those attitudes of the majority United States then influenced what was happening in Indian country for a long while, but you were able to bring that value as well, which is the respect value, respect for everybody, right, male or female. We have another question. What narrative or documentary film would you like to see made about Native people to help bring awareness? It's a pretty broad question, but
I think it would to take a child and see what they go through coming from an Indian family, what they go through just going through school and their grades, what they really have to, if the home base is not strong in their identity, then it really makes it hard for the child to go to school and be embarrassed because what happens at home, what they're talking about, even the teachers really need a lot of
Indian 101.
Indian 101, right?
well, and that's that whole issue.
The microaggressions each child has to live with and figure out how to respond to.
There's there's a show, and I can't remember the gentleman's name. He's African American. He's got a show about current issues, and he's said that I can't remember the percentage of African Americans who say they have mental health issues, but of that percentage, just about 90% of them say that those mental health issues are a direct result of racism, of white racism. And so you're saying that if other people could understand the amount of what we call microaggressions, that don't seem too micro sometimes.
Covert racism is what we're talking about.
And it's for Native Americans, it's so subtle sometimes. I mean, sometimes it's very overt, but it's these series of
well, the educated people and more sophisticated people have yet not gone through the experience and thinking through it differently. So when they're confronted with it, they get very uncomfortable. I've seen that 100 times in Washington.
Non-natives.
And so we had a good working group out there in McLean, Virginia, and so I invited some Oklahoma Indians were in town, so I said, well, come out and meet some of these folks. And so we had cocktails early in the afternoon, and one of our Indians had a little, maybe too much wine, I guess it was, that we served as a
Not important.
Yeah, not important, right? But this Indian saw this guy that had a
Bolo tie.
Yeah, a bolo tie on. And he said, he walked up to him, got hold of the bolo tie and said, if this was an Indian, I'd have to whip your ass. I mean, the hostility of that encounter in my house when I was trying to get people together to work together, but how deep it was and how hurtful it was that he could see that in a damn bolo tie.
And the surprise of the non-Native person that Native Americans too had rage over their experience.
So I think in answering to that question, though, that I think it's a very interesting point, and we're getting some of it now because we're getting more Native filmmakers and storytellers telling stories, and I think Res Dogs is a good example of that. But you know, I think would be a wonderful story to tell about a Native child in a, you know, as a minority in a public school, let's say, and the subtle pressures and covert racism that they encounter in the system. If filmmakers were to include aspects of Native culture in their storytelling, what are some resources, organizations, etc., that you can recommend?
First recommendation would be hire a Native.
Yes, and specifically, I'm going to back you up, is because I see this all the time. Not just hire a Native, but hire a Native person who is of the tribal ethnic culture that you are depicting, because they're not all the same.
Right. Yes, the cultures are very different. It's hard for people to, sometimes people say, I say, hi, I'm Comanche, and they say, oh, Cherokees. Right. And it's like they immediately go to that because they both start with C, but I mean, you could look at China and Czechoslovakia. They both start with C and they have very different cultures. And that's true of Comanches and Cherokees. One's a Plains tribe, the other's an East Coast tribe. I mean, all of those environments created different forces within the culture to express a connection to nature, but very different approaches.
What would you say to film non-Native filmmakers?
Well, I think so far we've done pretty good, considering there's not enough pressure on them. I enjoy or appreciate what you're doing, inviting us to talk about these things. So because in most cases they're not even conscious that they're doing these things.
It's true.
You know, they don't mean to be this way, or they've never thought of it because there's no literature, or there's not literature that could give them some guidance. So you have to say, you know, you have to try to be, I don't know, open and in watch your way, the way you put the termination kinds of things on whatever you're being asked, not to just jump on them and tear their idea of Indians alike, but figure out a dialogue that you could have with them, go to dinner with them, buy them a drink or whatever.
Get to know these people.
Yeah, because I think everybody wants to do the right thing. They just don't know how, and so they're embarrassed by their behavior.
So I've got, we're going to wrap up pretty soon, but I've got a couple more questions. So LaDonna, you've been in a very unique position to meet a lot of leaders and Native leaders who are no longer with us, who have walked on. Will your memoirs reflect on their personalities and leadership traits?
Yes.
I would think so.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Kennedys lived Bobby Kennedy and his family lived right across corner. And by that time, if Ethel said anything that was inappropriate in my view, I would correct her in a funny way, try to make a joke out of it, but make her more sensitive because she had all those children. And they all become, and they invited my grandmother, who still wears tradition, at that time,
Native leaders.
Wore her Comanche clothes all the time. And so when they came, when Ethel invited her to come, everybody invited her all over Washington. She was the most popular thing. Fred couldn't keep up with us because we were in the White House. Lady Bird Johnson wanted to take her picture with her, and the journalists were all asking about her, and I forgot what the journalist said.
I don't know, but we're running out of time.
Yeah, so actually, before we close.
Yeah, Joe Santos is a good one who.
Oh,
Jean Crawford.
There's ones I think about are gone.
Reuben Snake.
Reuben Snake was really outstanding, and his tribe was. They contributed a lot to everybody's growth.
You know, we could go on for 2 hours with you ladies, because it's just so informative, and you're so wonderful to speak with and articulate. And I look forward to talking with you again on some of these other subjects. But in closing to our Q&A, could you please just reiterate the 4 R's for us? Because I think that they pertain to everything, including filmmakers who want to make films. And if you could just do that for us.
We named them the 4 R's so we could remember them, but
at 90,
it's hard to remember all 4 of them. Relationships, responsibility, reciprocity, and redistribution.
Okay, thank you so much. And I encourage everybody to view the screening of LaDonna Harris Indian 101. It is a wonderful, heartwarming, and informative documentary, and I enjoy it every time I watch it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maura.
Wonderful having you be the moderator.
My pleasure. I love you all so much.
Thank you, ladies. That was an informative, important, and awesome, inspiring conversation. And like Maura mentioned, please take time to see the LaDonna Harris Indian 101 documentary, which will have its AFMX premiere Saturday, September 25th at 4 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. This is a free film block, so please take advantage of this opportunity. And if you can't catch it on Saturday, it is available until October 11th. Thank you again to our moderators. Please stand by for our next event, which is later on this afternoon. Please check our website at AFMXNM.com. I believe it's a 2 o'clock film block with our moderator, Ramona King. Thank you again for your time, and we look forward to seeing you soon.